All right, so April 19th, 1775. It's a date, that's more than just a day on the calendar, right? I mean, as the sun came up over Massachusetts that morning, things were happening that would change history. Big time. Welcome to the deep dive. And today, well, we're diving headfirst into the battles of Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to break down that day, April 19th, 1775, the day that simmering tension between the American colonies and Great Britain, well, it boiled over into a real, shooting war. And we've gone through a lot of sources, firsthand accounts, historical analyses to get to the bottom of what happened and, more importantly, why it matters.
Right. And as always, our mission here is to find those nuggets of knowledge, the key insights that help you really grasp these events. It's not just about dates and names. We want to dig into the motives, the context, and maybe even some surprising details that often get missed. So let's set the stage. What was going on that led to this explosion on that April morning?
Well, there was a lot building up. After the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament came back swinging with those measures in 1774. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, and they hated them.
Right, the intolerable acts.
Yeah, and these weren't just about taxes. They were messing with the colony's ability to govern themselves, closing Boston Harbor, changing their courts. Many colonists saw it as a direct attack on their rights as Englishmen, and that pushed even the folks who weren't super radical towards, actually resisting.
It wasn't just talk either, was it? The colonists started to actually prepare for a potential fight.
Exactly. They formed the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, basically a shadow government operating outside of British control. And this Congress started calling for local militias to train. They could see the writing on the wall. By February 1775, things were serious. The British government declared Massachusetts to be an open rebellion.
So the British knew things were getting out of hand. What was their strategy? How are they going to deal with this growing defiance?
General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, he was in a tough spot. He wanted to avoid a big war. So his plan was to get ahead of things, seize military supplies that the Patriot militias were stockpiling, especially in Concord. There have even been earlier incidents, the powder alarms, where they tried to grab gunpowder and other stuff.
It's easy to imagine these militias just popping up overnight, but they actually had a pretty deep history in the colonies, right?
Oh, absolutely. Militias were a part of life in the colonies from the very beginning, mostly for defense against Native American attacks. They even fought alongside British regulars in the French and Indian War. Each New England colony had laws that said towns had to have militia companies, with most men over 16 expected to be part of it and have their own weapons. Yeah. These local militias elected their own officers, and it created this sense of, community responsibility for defense. So even after Gage shut down the official government, these militias were already organized and ready to resist. They saw themselves as the protectors of their towns. They really embodied this idea of local control, which of course clashed with the British desire to control everything from London.
And I imagine the British government had a very different view of these militias, right?
Oh, totally. As you mentioned, in February of 1775, the British Parliament told King George III point blank that Massachusetts was in rebellion, and they promised to back him up all the way in crushing it.
Which leads us right to April 19th. What were the British hoping to accomplish that day?
Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, he got secret orders to take about 700 British regulars to Concord. Their main mission: find, grab, and destroy the colonial military supplies they believed were stored there. It's interesting, though, Gage didn't actually put in writing any orders to arrest specific rebel leaders. He was probably worried that would cause a massive uprising.
Makes sense. But the British needed the element of surprise, right? Seems like the Patriots had their own intel operation going on.
They did. Weeks before, Patriot leaders had gotten warnings about their supplies being at risk, so they moved a lot of them to safer spots. And then just before the 19th, they got some crucial information about the British coming. Some people even think Margaret Gage, the general's wife, might have leaked it. Apparently, she was sympathetic to the colonists.
Wow, really? Okay, now we're getting to the legendary stuff. Tell me about how the warning got spread, Paul Revere's ride and all that. It's practically a myth at this point, right?
Yeah. It is legendary, but it was a real part of a bigger, well-organized intelligence and warning system. Late on the 18th, around 9 or 10 p.m., Joseph Warren, a big Patriot leader in Boston, sent Paul Revere and William Dawes out to warn the colonists about the British troops moving. Warren's intel said British troops were going by boat from Boston, across the Charles River, towards Cambridge, and that would put them on the road to Lexington and Concord. At first, they were worried about John Adams and John Hancock, who were staying in Lexington. They didn't think Concord, where they thought the supplies were safer, was the main target.
I see. So Revere and Dawes set out to warn them. Tell me about the signal from the church and the different routes they took.
Revere, he set it up so a signal would be sent from the Old North Church in Boston to Charlestown. One if by land, two if by sea, showing which way the British were crossing the river. Then he actually rowed across the river himself, right past the British warship HMS Somerset in the harbor. That's pretty daring. Dawes, meanwhile, took a longer land route, through Boston Neck and over the Great Bridge, also heading for Lexington. Both of them made it to Lexington and warned Adams and Hancock.
And they didn't stop at just warning Lexington, did they?
No, not at all. Once they got to Lexington, Revere, Dawes, Adams, and Hancock realized that the size of the British force meant they were probably after more than just arresting two guys. They figured Concord and the supplies there were the real target, so they sent more riders out to spread the alarm to other towns. Revere and Dawes, now joined by a local doctor, Samuel Prescott, continued towards Concord. But in Lincoln, they ran into a British patrol. Revere was captured, Dawes got thrown from his horse and had to run away. But Prescott, he got away and made it to Concord to sound the alarm. And, riders went out from Concord too as soon as word reached them.
Sounds a little chaotic, but effective in the end, like a very early warning system.
It was incredibly effective. The rides of Revere, Dawes, Prescott, and all the other less famous riders, they set off this alarm and muster system that covered eastern Massachusetts. It wasn't just guys on horseback, it was a whole network. Church bells ringing, drums beating, alarm guns firing, even bonfires on hilltops. It was all about spreading the news fast. This system had been improved after those earlier powder alarms, and it worked like a charm. People 25 miles away from Boston knew the British were on the move, while those troops were still getting off their boats back in Cambridge. This early warning was crucial for the local militias to gather and get ready.
All right, so the alarm is out, militias are mobilizing. Let's focus on the first clash, when the British got to Lexington.
Okay, so the British regulars, about 700 of them under Lieutenant Colonel Smith, were marching toward Lexington. Leading the way was Major John Pitcairn, with 6 companies of light infantry, about 350 men. As the sun came up over Lexington Common, around 80 Lexington militiamen, led by Captain John Parker, were gathered there. There were also quite a few people just watching, maybe 40 to 100. Now, it's important to understand this was the town's training band. It was the traditional way they organized the militia, where all able-bodied men would train every now and then. It wasn't a dedicated Minuteman company that was super mobile, although some of those present were Minutemen too, and many of these guys, they were all related in this small town.
So they knew the British were coming.
They did. Thaddeus Bowman, a scout Parker had sent out, came riding back. He said the British were close, and there were a lot of them. Parker knew he was outnumbered. He was probably more interested in making a political statement by just being there on the common than actually fighting, especially since most of the supplies in Concord had already been moved.
That makes sense. So what did Captain Parker tell his men to do? You know, that famous quote, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon." It's such a big part of the story.
Well, yeah, some people who were there remember those exact words years later, and it's become a powerful symbol. But Parker's official statement, given under oath right after the battle, it tells a slightly different story. He said he told his men to meet on the common to figure out what to do. They decided not to engage the British unless they were provoked, and when the British suddenly showed up, he ordered his men to scatter and not shoot. He swore that the British rushed forward and fired on his retreating men without any reason.
So even if the exact words might be debated, the basic understanding is that the militia wasn't looking for a fight. What actually happened when the British got to Lexington Common?
It's interesting. The British advance guard, led by Lieutenant Jesse Adair of the Marines, they made a right turn onto the common, instead of going straight toward Concord. It looked like they were trying to surround the militia. Then Major Pitcairn got there with his 3 companies. He moved left and stopped his men. The main body of British troops, with Colonel Smith, was still further back down the road.
And then we have that moment everyone talks about, the shot heard round the world. We still don't know for sure who fired it, right?
It's one of the biggest mysteries in American history. Most likely, it was a British officer, probably Major Pitcairn, but no one's 100% sure. Anyway, this officer rode forward, waving his sword, and told the militia to disperse. He might have even told them to lay down their weapons. At the same time, Parker was apparently telling his men to scatter and go home. But in all that confusion and noise, not everyone heard the orders or moved fast enough. Both Parker and Pitcairn later said they told their men not to shoot. But then, that single shot rang out. No one knows for sure where it came from.
And that single shot changed everything.
Oh, yeah. Some British soldiers claim they were shot at first by the colonists, maybe from behind a wall or the Buckman Tavern. But many more witnesses, including a lot of Parker's men, swore under oaths they didn't shoot first. Some even thought, at first, that the British were just firing blanks as a warning. The historian David Hackett Fisher has this interesting theory. He thinks there might have been several shots fired at almost the same time, by people on both sides in those tense moments before the real shooting started. But regardless of who fired first, the British soldiers, who were probably on edge after a long march and months of tension and taunting, they started firing volleys into the militia who were trying to scatter. They did this without any direct orders.
Wow, sounds like chaos. What happened in Lexington? What was the outcome of that?
The British charged with bayonets fixed. 8 Lexington men were killed right there on the common, including Robert Monroe, who was Parker's third in command. 10 more were wounded, including Prince Estabrook, a black man who was enslaved and serving in the militia. The British, amazingly, only had one minor injury. After that initial burst of firing and the bayonet charge, Colonel Smith got there with the main British force. He got things back under control, and then the light infantry fired a celebratory volley, a victory volley. Then they got back in formation and continued marching toward Concord.
A really tragic start to the day.
Oh,
Okay, so let's move on to Concord. What was going on there while the British were marching over from Lexington?
Well, the alarm was spreading quickly. The militias from Concord and Lincoln, the next town over, had gathered in Concord. When they heard the shooting from Lexington, they started marching east toward the Sound, thinking they could intercept the British. But then they got better intel about how many British were coming, and they decided to pull back to a ridge overlooking Concord. It was a good strategic position. Later, under Colonel James Barrett, they moved even further west, across the North Bridge to Punkatasset Hill. From there, they could see the British coming into Concord.
So the Concord militia was watching the British enter the town. What did the British do when they got to Concord?
Lieutenant Colonel Smith, following his orders, he split his forces to find and destroy the colonial supplies. One company secured the South Bridge into Concord, and then a larger group, about 100 light infantry under Captain Parsons, went to secure the North Bridge. Parsons then sent 4 companies from his group to search Barrett's farm, a few miles north of the bridge. They thought supplies might be hidden there. That left a pretty small group of British at the North Bridge, maybe 90 to 95 soldiers, led by Captain Walter Laurie. Laurie realized they were in a tough spot, outnumbered by about 400 militiamen on Punkatasset Hill. He sent a messenger back to Smith asking for reinforcements, fast.
So while all that was going on at the North Bridge, the main British force was busy looking for those hidden military supplies in Concord itself. Did they find anything?
They did find some cannons that had been buried at Ephraim Jones's tavern. They disabled those. They also found and burned a few gun carriages that were stored in the town's meeting house. But get this, a local woman, Martha Moulton, she actually convinced the British to help put out the fire when it started to spread to the meeting house itself. Pretty brave. And here's another interesting thing. Most of the flour and musket balls they took, they didn't destroy them, they just dumped them in the mill pond. The colonists actually fished a lot of that stuff out later.
Clever.
Yeah. Overall, it seems like the British soldiers were fairly restrained when they were searching homes and businesses. They even paid for food and drinks at the taverns, which, probably helped the colonists hide smaller stashes of supplies. But the guys who went to Barrett's farm, they searched really hard, but didn't find much of anything useful.
Okay, so the British didn't have much luck finding those supplies. Meanwhile, the militia was watching all of this from Punkatasset Hill. What made them decide to move back toward the North Bridge?
Well, they saw smoke rising from the town square. It was the British burning those gun carriages they found. Colonel Barrett got worried that the British might destroy more stuff, and he saw that there weren't that many of them guarding the North Bridge, so he decided to move his militia back toward the town. They advanced from Punkatasset Hill to another hill, closer to the North Bridge. As this much larger force of colonists came towards them, the 2 British companies that were near the road on the Concord side of the bridge, they fell back across the bridge. They basically gave up that high ground to the colonists.
So now we're set for the big confrontation at the North Bridge. What happened there?
At this point, there were at least 400 men on that hill overlooking the bridge. 5 full companies of Minutemen and 5 more companies of militia from Acton, Concord, Bedford, and Lincoln. Colonel Barrett told them to form a long line, and then he talked with his officers about whether to move forward. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, he's famous for saying, "I'm not afraid to go, and I haven't a man that's afraid to go," when they asked him if his company would lead the way. Barrett then gave the order, Load your weapons, but don't shoot unless they shoot at you first. Then he told them to march toward the bridge. Captain Laurie, facing this huge force of colonists, he ordered his men to retreat across the bridge back to the Concord side.
But things got out of hand pretty quickly, didn't they?
Unfortunately, yeah. As the Colonial militia was marching in a column across that narrow causeway leading to the bridge, a shot was fired. Captain Laurie himself said it was probably one of his own men who panicked and fired. Then two more shots came from the British side, and then the main group of British fired a volley before Laurie could stop them. This first volley hit the front of the advancing colonists. Private Abner Hosmer and Captain Isaac Davis, both from Acton, were killed instantly, and others were wounded.
So the colonists had been ordered not to shoot unless fired upon. How did they react to this?
Major John Buttrick, he saw his men falling and shouted, "Fire, for God's sakes, fellow soldiers, fire!" And even though they weren't in a perfect formation anymore because of that narrow causeway, the colonists fired back. Their volley hit the British hard. 4 out of the 8 British officers and sergeants who were leading the attack were wounded, and at least 3 British privates were killed or mortally wounded. 9 more were injured. The British, who were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and now losing men, they panicked. They probably weren't very experienced in battle anyway. They broke ranks and ran from the North Bridge. That left Captain Parsons and his 4 companies still stuck out at Barrett's Farm.
So, a victory for the colonists at the North Bridge. What happened next?
Lieutenant Colonel Smith heard the shooting and came running with 2 companies of grenadiers. He got there just as the retreating light infantry reached him. They were in bad shape. Smith was really worried about those 4 companies that were still out at Barrett's Farm. Then he saw all the militiamen behind a stone wall overlooking the road, and he stopped his troops. He and his officers went forward to see what was going on. For about 10 minutes, both sides just stared at each other. It was a very tense standoff. And get this, a local guy actually walked right through both lines selling cider during this standoff. Finally, the detachment that had been searching Barrett's Farm came back. They were pretty shaken up by seeing the dead and wounded British soldiers at the North Bridge. They joined up with Smith, and around 11:30 a.m., the British retreated back into Concord. They ate lunch, tried to regroup, and finally started marching back toward Boston afternoon. That delay turned out to be really important because it gave even more Colonial militia time to get in position along their route.
The march back from Concord to Lexington sounds like a complete nightmare for the British.
It was a brutal fight the whole way. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was worried about his men, so he sent out flankers to protect the column. But as they marched east out of Concord, they got to Merriam's Corner. It was a crossroads where the road got really narrow at a bridge over Elmbrook. The British had to pull in their flankers to cross, and the militia was closing in. They had a big advantage in numbers now. As the last of the British crossed that bridge, the rear guard fired a volley at the colonists, and the colonists fired right back, and they were good shots. They killed 2 British soldiers and wounded several more.
And the militia just kept attacking.
They never let up. At Brooks Hill, almost 500 militiamen ambushed the British column from the south, causing a lot of casualties. The British tried a bayonet charge to drive them off, but the colonists held their ground. The British kept marching to Brooks Tavern in Lincoln, where even more militia attacked from the north. Then they came to a spot that later became known as the Bloody Angle, although people didn't call it that back then. At this spot, the Woburn militia and others had set up a perfect crossfire, and they inflicted huge losses on the tightly packed British ranks. Sadly, 4 Colonial militiamen were also killed in this fighting. The British managed to escape this trap by speeding up, basically running. The colonists had a harder time keeping up in the woods and swampy terrain.
I imagine the colonial forces were growing rapidly at this point as more and more militia arrived.
Oh yeah, they had about 2,000 men by then, as militia from towns further away kept showing up. Even with the flankers, the British were getting hit hard by all the militia hiding and firing from long range. The British were exhausted, and they were running out of ammo. As they got close to Lexington, they were ambushed again, this time by Captain John Parker's Lexington militia. Some of these guys still had bandages from the fighting earlier that morning. It was in this fight that Lieutenant Colonel Smith was wounded in the thigh, and Major John Pitcairn had to take command. Things were looking pretty desperate for the British. They had to attack 2 more hills, the Bluff and Fisk Hill, to clear their path, and they lost even more men to militia ambushes. Major Pitcairn even got hurt when his horse was spooked during one of these skirmishes. Yeah. At this point, both of their commanders were wounded, their men were exhausted, they were running out of ammunition, their whole formation was about to fall apart.
It sounds like the British were about to be wiped out. How did they manage to escape?
Back in Boston, General Gage was getting nervous about Smith. He actually drafted orders for reinforcements at 4 a.m., but he was so worried about secrecy that only one copy of the orders made it to the adjutant. When Smith's desperate call for help finally reached Boston around 5 a.m., the 1st Brigade, about 1,000 men with artillery, was ordered to get ready. But there were more delays, and Earl Percy, who was leading them, didn't leave Boston until 8:45 a.m. They marched toward Lexington, reportedly to the tune of Yankee Doodle, which must have been a bit ironic.
So Percy arrives with reinforcement. That's a big turning point for the British, right?
It absolutely saved them. Percy took a longer land route across Boston Neck and got delayed a few times. He finally got to Lexington around 2 p.m., and by then he'd been hearing the gunfire for a while. He started setting up his troops and artillery, and just then, Smith's men came straggling in. Percy said they looked like a fleeing mob. The militia was right on their heels. Percy immediately ordered his artillery to fire, even though they were pretty far away, and that scattered the colonists. Smith's men were completely exhausted, and they just collapsed when they reached the safety of Percy's lines. Oh, there's another interesting thing. Percy had left Boston without enough ammo wagons. 2 wagons that were sent later to resupply him were ambushed and captured by a small group of older, experienced militiamen, so the British were running low on bullets.
Wow. So now Earl Percy is in charge, and he has a much larger force. What did they do next? The retreat to Charlestown must have been tough.
Yeah, Percy took command of about 1,700 men now. He let them rest and reorganize for a bit at Monroe Tavern. They left around 3:30 p.m., but this time they were in a defensive formation with a strong rear guard. They would rotate who was in the rear guard so no one unit would get pounded too hard by the militia attacks, which were still going on. Brigadier General William Heath was now in charge of the militia, and he saw how dangerous the British artillery was. So he told his men to avoid those tight formations and use what they called skirmishing tactics instead. Basically, they'd hide behind trees, walls, and buildings and shoot at the British as they marched. The fighting got really bad when the British got to Minutemen, which is Arlington today. New militia kept coming, and they kept shooting at the British. Even the people who lived there started fighting from their homes and shops. There were heavy casualties on both sides in this street fighting. 21 Colonial fighters were killed just at the Jason Russell House, and some of the British soldiers, probably mad about their losses and maybe hearing rumors that the colonists were scalping their dead, they started attacking civilians. There's a story of Samuel Whitmore, an 84-year-old man who supposedly killed 3 British soldiers before they wounded him and left him for dead. The fighting in Minutemen and then in Cambridge, that's where the most people died that day. More than at Lexington and Concord combined. The colonists lost 25 men killed and 9 wounded there. The British lost 40 killed and around 80 wounded. As they went through Cambridge, Percy used his artillery to slow down the militia. He stopped their advance for a while at Watson's Corner. Percy realized the militia was trying to surround him, so he led his men down a narrow track, which is Beach Street today. That broke the encirclement. The Americans tried to take Prospect Hill, which was important high ground, but Percy used his last artillery rounds to stop them. Then a big group of militia came from Salem and Marblehead and got to Winter Hill. But their leader, Colonel Timothy Pickering, stopped there. He maybe thought a final attack on the British would be too bloody and would work. So because of that, the British made it to Charlestown.
Wow.
Yeah. They had one last fight as they entered Charlestown. Pitcairn's Marines, who had stayed in Charlestown, managed to hold off the militia. The British were completely exhausted by now, but they finally made it to Charlestown Neck, where they were protected by the guns of HMS Somerset, the British warship. Gage immediately sent more troops to occupy and fortify the high ground in Charlestown, but they never finished those fortifications. General Heath, seeing how strong the British position was, decided to pull the militia back to their lines around Cambridge.
So the next morning, everything had changed. Boston was under siege by a large colonial army.
That's right. By the morning of April 20th, there were more than 15,000 militias from all over New England surrounding Boston. This wasn't like the powder alarms anymore. This was a full-blown war. Shots had been fired. People had been killed. General Artemus Ward, he was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and he took command of the colonial forces. They started setting up a siege line around Boston, trapping the British inside. Militias from other colonies started showing up too, and they eventually became part of what we know as the Continental Army. General Gage still didn't want to declare martial law in Boston, though. He made a deal with the city leaders. If the people of Boston would hand over their guns, he'd let them leave the city safely.
So the British went out to prevent a fight and seize weapons, and they ended up starting a war and hardly got any weapons. Seems like their plan backfired completely.
Totally. They failed to stop the fighting and barely seized any weapons. Right after the battles, there was a propaganda war. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress knew they had to control the story, so they got sworn statements from people who were there and sent their version of what happened to London. This account was printed in British newspapers before General Gage's official report even got there, and it made a lot of people in Britain turn against the government and how they were handling the situation. And among the British military and politicians, well, a lot of them blamed General Gage and Lieutenant Colonel Smith for the whole mess.
And what about the leaders of the revolution? How did they react to the news of Lexington and Concord?
It was a huge turning point for them. For John Adams, Lexington and Concord meant there was no going back. He was convinced they had to separate from Britain. Thomas Paine, he thought maybe they could work things out through negotiations. But now he saw the King of England as a tyrant who had started a war. Even George Washington, who was always cautious, he was worried about what this meant for America, and he started to think about what he might do to help. The news even reached the frontier. Some hunters in what's Kentucky today, they heard about the battle and decided to name their camp Lexington. That's how the city got its name. It's interesting, in the beginning of the war, the new American government wanted to make the British look like the bad guys. They wanted to look like innocent victims. So sometimes they left out parts of the story that showed how much the Patriots had been preparing for a fight. But later on, the story changed. Americans started to celebrate the Patriots who fought back against the British.
It's amazing how much these battles shaped American history and identity. How are they remembered today?
Well, there's Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, Concord Hymn. He wrote it for the dedication of the monument at the North Bridge. That line about the shot heard around the world has become a symbol of the whole American Revolution. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, even though it's not perfectly accurate historically, is how a lot of people learned about that night. In the 20th century, people's views of Lexington and Concord changed depending on what was going on in the world. During the Cold War, for example, people focused on the ideas of freedom and fighting tyranny. The places where the battles happened are still there. Lexington Battle Green and Minuteman National Historical Park. They have monuments, memorials, and exhibits that help people connect with what happened that day. And several units in the U.S. Army today can trace their history back to the men who fought in those battles. Ships in the Navy have been named after the Battle of Lexington, too. And there's Patriots' Day, celebrated every year in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine on the third Monday of April. They have reenactments and ceremonies to remember the battles. The 100th and 200th anniversaries of the battles were big national events. President Ford gave a speech at the Bicentennial in 1975, talking about how important these first shots were. The post office even issued commemorative stamps in 1925 for the 150th anniversary.
So, to wrap up our deep dive, it's clear that Lexington and Concord weren't just small fights. They were the start of the American Revolution. The bravery of the militias, their great communication network, and their growing resistance to British rule, all of that came together on that day.
Absolutely. Emerson's phrase, the shot heard round the world, it's really powerful. It captures how those first shots, in a way, changed the world.
And on that note, here's something to think about. Imagine how actions that seem small and local, actions taken by ordinary people who are determined to stand up for themselves, how those actions can suddenly turn into huge historical events that change the world. And think about how the stories we tell about those events, even hundreds of years later, they keep changing. Our perspective changes. How we see ourselves as a nation changes. Time passes. It all affects the story. Maybe you want to dig a little deeper into the stories of the people who were there that day, on both sides, or maybe you want to explore the long-term effects of those first shots. It's all fascinating stuff. And that's the end of our deep dive for today.